23 years ago, a promising film student disappeared after heading to what should have been a routine test shoot. Her mother refused to accept she was gone, holding on to hope through decades of silence. Then, when investigators finally reopened the cold case file, they discovered one overlooked detail that would change everything. Before we uncover what really happened that spring morning in Utah, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're captivated by cold cases that refuse to stay buried, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode from the Cold Case Desk. 23 years ago. That's how long it's been since Rachel Lyndon disappeared. 23 years of questions without answers. 23 years of a mother refusing to give up hope. 23 years of a case that seemed so straightforward on the surface but hid secrets that nobody could have imagined. This is the story of how one overlooked detail changed everything, and it starts on a spring morning in Utah when everything still seemed possible. Utah in the spring of 2002 was a different America. This was before smartphones became extensions of our hands. Before social media documented every moment of our lives. Before doorbell cameras and GPS tracking turned privacy into a quaint memory. This was a time when disappearing, truly disappearing, was still possible in ways that seem almost unimaginable today. The Wasatch Range, that magnificent spine of mountains running through Utah, still wore its winter coat of snow on the highest peaks. Below, in the valleys where people actually lived, spring was taking hold. The towns stretching along the Salt Lake Valley moved at their own pace, shaped by the rhythms of community and the religious values that had defined this region for generations. Provo sat nestled in this landscape, a small university city where the sound of church bells mixed with the rumble of student buses and the rich aroma of coffee drifted from the little shops clustered around Brigham Young University's campus. The local economy revolved around education, light manufacturing, and religious services. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else, or at least knew someone who knew them. The crime rate was so remarkably low that any incident, even something minor, would become the talk of the town for weeks. People didn't lock their doors. Children played outside until the streetlights came on. Trust was the default setting. Communication in 2002 meant landlines and email that took forever to load. Cell phones existed, but they were chunky things used mainly for calls, not the sophisticated devices we carry today. Security cameras were only starting to appear along commercial corridors, and even when they existed, the footage they captured was grainy, unreliable, often useless. There was no cloud storage, no ring of surveillance that captured every movement. If something happened, there might be no record of it at all. In this setting, in this time, Rachel Lyndon was living what seemed like an ordinary life. She was 21 years old, a senior studying film at Brigham Young University. She lived in an old student apartment complex near campus, the kind of building where the heating was unpredictable and the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbors' conversations. But it was home, the way these places become home when you're young and full of dreams about the future. To her friends, to her roommate, to the neighbors who saw her coming and going, Rachel was known as calm and serious. She wasn't the type to party until dawn or skip classes or make impulsive decisions. She had a routine, and she rarely deviated from it. That kind of reliability can be comforting. It can also be the thing that makes your absence immediately noticeable. Rachel was passionate about film, specifically about the technical side of cinematography. She wanted to understand light and shadow, how to use a camera to tell stories that words couldn't capture. She spent hours in the university's film labs, studying the work of masters, experimenting with different techniques. Her professors saw potential in her. Her classmates respected her dedication. She was the kind of student who asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers. In May of 2002, an opportunity came Rachel's way. A local director named Marcus Tate was working on an independent short film project and needed help with a lighting test. Tate had been promoting himself around the Salt Lake area as a promising young filmmaker, someone on the verge of breaking through. He talked a good game about his vision, his artistic integrity, his refusal to compromise. He had managed to rent space in an old warehouse complex in South Salt Lake, where he was building sets and planning his shoot. For a film student like Rachel, the chance to work on a real production, even in a small capacity, was valuable experience. She agreed to help with the lighting test. The shoot was scheduled for the morning of Friday, May 10th. Just a few hours of work, nothing complicated. Rachel would drive up to the warehouse, help Tate set up some lights, test different configurations, maybe learn something new about the craft she loved. Then she'd drive back home, probably grab lunch with her roommate, spend the afternoon editing a project for class. It should have been routine. It should have been forgettable. It should have been just another day in the life of a college senior counting down to graduation. That Friday morning, Rachel woke up in her apartment as the early light filtered through her curtains. She went through her morning routine, probably had some breakfast, definitely made her bed with the precision she was known for. She gathered what she needed for the day, a bag with some script pages, a film drive with footage she'd been working on, maybe a notebook. She put on a light-colored jacket, something practical for a morning that started cool but would warm up by afternoon. She checked that she had her keys, her phone, everything she needed. Her neighbors saw her leaving. They would remember this later, when every detail mattered. They saw her walking to her car, a silver Honda Civic parked in the apartment complex lot. She was smiling, they said. Not a big grin, just a small, content smile, the kind you wear when you're looking forward to something. The early season sunlight slanted across the hood of her car as she unlocked the driver's side door. She tossed her bag onto the passenger seat, slid behind the wheel, started the engine. The car pulled out of the parking lot smoothly, no hesitation, no looking back. It merged into the light northbound traffic heading toward Interstate 15, the main artery connecting Provo to Salt Lake City. And then Rachel Lyndon vanished. Nobody saw her after that morning. Nobody heard from her. The silver Honda Civic disappeared into the flow of traffic, and it was as if Rachel had simply ceased to exist. By the time the sun began its descent behind the mountains that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Rachel's apartment remained dark and silent. The hallway lights stayed on all night, casting their pale glow on her door, which didn't open. She didn't call her roommate. She didn't send an email or leave a voicemail. Her cell phone had gone dead that morning, and every attempt to reach her was met with silence. Emily Park, Rachel's roommate, wasn't immediately worried. Rachel had said she'd be back before noon, but plans change. Maybe the lighting test took longer than expected. Maybe she grabbed lunch with someone from the crew. Maybe her phone battery died and she hadn't had a chance to charge it. These things happen. Emily made dinner for herself, watched some television, went to bed assuming Rachel had crashed at a friend's place and would show up tomorrow with an explanation. But when Saturday morning came and Rachel still wasn't home, when her bed remained empty and made from the day before, when her phone still went straight to voicemail, Emily's concern shifted into something sharper. Something closer to fear. She called Rachel's parents in Cedar Hills. The phone call that changed everything came in at the start of the morning shift at the Provo Police Department. Rachel's father was on the line, his voice carrying that particular quality of forced calm that comes when you're trying not to think about worst-case scenarios. His daughter had gone to a work meeting in South Salt Lake the previous morning. She hadn't come home. She wasn't answering her phone. This wasn't like her. Could someone please check on her? The dispatcher took down the information, passed it to a patrol unit in the area. Within an hour, 2 officers were approaching the 3-story apartment building tucked behind late-blooming cherry trees where Rachel lived. The building had that slightly shabby look common to student housing, paint peeling in places, one gutter hanging loose. The officers climbed the stairs to Rachel's apartment on the 2nd floor. The door was unlocked. That detail would matter later. The door was unlocked, but it showed absolutely no signs of forced entry. No scratches around the lock. No damage to the frame. It had simply been left open, or perhaps had never been locked in the first place. Inside, the apartment was almost eerily tidy. Everything in its place. Storyboards were still stacked neatly on the desk by the window, the edges perfectly aligned the way someone meticulous about their work would arrange them. A mini DV camcorder sat on the shelf, its lens cap on, power cord coiled beside it. The bed was made with military precision, corners tucked, pillow centered. Morning light sliced through half-drawn curtains, illuminating dust motes hanging in the air, casting shadows across a room that felt suspended in time. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture. No scattered belongings. No evidence of anything wrong at all, except for the absence of the person who lived there. In the small kitchen area, a dirty plate and a glass still damp from recent use sat in the sink. Breakfast dishes from the morning before, left to be washed later. Later never came. The officers checked the closet, noting that the outfit Rachel had worn the day before was missing, matching the descriptions from neighbors who'd seen her leave. Emily was brought in for a statement. She told the officers what she knew. Rachel had mentioned going to a lighting test with an independent director named Marcus Tate. She'd said she would be back before noon. When she didn't come home and her phone was disconnected, Emily had assumed she was with friends. But by midnight, that assumption had curdled into worry. Now it was Saturday morning, more than 24 hours since anyone had seen or heard from Rachel, and Emily's worry had become something much darker. The neighbors confirmed what Emily had said. There had been no unusual noises the previous day. No shouting, no sounds of a struggle, no strangers hanging around. They had only seen Rachel leave early that morning with her bag and a stack of papers. One resident who lived in the apartment below Rachel's remembered hearing an engine start and a car door close, then silence again. Normal sounds. Unremarkable sounds. The sounds of someone going about their day. The preliminary report filed that Saturday morning was brief and clinical in the way police reports always are, stripping emotion from tragedy. Victim left residence morning of 5:10. Did not return. No contact. When officers checked the parking lot, Rachel's silver Honda Civic was gone. The space where she normally parked was empty, marked only by a small oil stain on the asphalt. The officers contacted Rachel's parents, who drove to Provo immediately. They confirmed what Emily had said and added more details. Rachel had no plans to leave town. She had no personal conflicts with anyone. No relationship drama. No financial pressure. No reason whatsoever to disappear. She was weeks away from graduating. She had been talking excitedly about a summer internship she'd applied for. She had plans, a future, reasons to be exactly where she was supposed to be. Initial checks with Rachel's bank and cell phone provider painted a concerning picture. There had been no credit card activity in the past 24 hours. No ATM withdrawals. No purchases. Her debit card sat unused while time ticked by. The phone signal had been lost since the previous morning, somewhere around the time she should have been arriving at the warehouse for the lighting test. After that, nothing. The phone was either turned off, dead, or destroyed. Given Rachel's stable academic record, her responsible nature, her solid finances, and her consistent lifestyle, investigators quickly concluded that the likelihood of her leaving voluntarily was extremely low. This wasn't a troubled young woman running from problems. This wasn't someone who might have decided on impulse to start a new life somewhere else. This was a responsible student who told people where she was going and when she'd be back, and then simply didn't come back. An official report was filed under case number 02RL175, classified as missing person, open investigation. A contact list was compiled, names and numbers of everyone who might have information. And at the very top of that list, written in careful block letters by the investigating officer, was the name Marcus Tate. The only person who had a scheduled meeting with Rachel on the day she vanished. The person she was going to meet when she drove away from her apartment that Friday morning. the last person who should have seen her alive. The final note on the initial report was understated but ominous: no signs of criminal activity at the residence, but the disappearance is deemed suspicious. Expanded investigation required. That single sentence set in motion a chain of events that would consume hundreds of hours of police work, shatter lives, and ultimately lead nowhere for more than 20 years. From that initial report, the investigative team was given a clear directive: reconstruct every single movement Rachel Lyndon made on the morning she disappeared. Account for every minute. Track every mile. Find the point where her normal day became something else entirely. The first data came from Emily and the neighbors, confirming that Rachel had left her apartment early, carrying her bag and those script pages. She'd been smiling. She'd seemed fine. Nothing unusual. Police canvassed the likely route from the Provo student housing area to the South Salt Lake industrial zone where she was supposed to be working. It was roughly a 40-mile stretch along Interstate 15, that major highway that serves as the main artery connecting Provo to downtown Salt Lake City. 40 miles of road where anything could have happened. Patrol units were deployed along the highway, checking rest stops, convenience stores, gas stations, any place Rachel might have visited. In Lehi, a small city about halfway between Provo and Salt Lake, the team caught their first break. A clerk at a convenience store near the highway remembered a young woman with brown hair and a light-colored jacket buying coffee to go that morning. Just coffee, nothing else. She'd seemed normal, not distressed or worried. Just another customer on another morning. Police obtained the store's security footage, such as it was. The image quality was grainy and noisy, the kind of footage that would be laughable by today's standards. But it was enough. It clearly showed a silver Honda Civic at Pump 3, and when they enhanced the image as much as their technology would allow, they could make out a license plate that matched Rachel's character for character. The timestamp on the footage confirmed she'd been there within the estimated travel window. She'd stopped for coffee on her way to the warehouse, exactly the kind of thing someone would do on a normal morning. Further along the route, investigators found nothing useful. 2 other stores had no footage at all. Either their cameras were offline, or they only kept recordings for 3 days and had already recorded over anything from Friday. This was the reality of 2002, surveillance existed, but it was spotty, unreliable, often useless when you actually needed it. The tech team checked the automated traffic system on Interstate 15, hoping for something, anything. But in 2002, there were no speed cameras or centralized traffic monitoring in Utah. No system automatically photographing license plates. No database tracking which cars were where at what time. If Rachel's car had problems on the highway, if someone had followed her, if something had happened between Lehi and South Salt Lake, there would be no record of it. After cross-referencing local maps and the limited information they had, investigators narrowed their search to the South Salt Lake industrial area, specifically to the old warehouses along West Temple where Marcus Tate had rented his space. This was where Rachel had been heading. This was where the trail would either continue or end. A security camera at a nearby trucking company's parking lot provided the crucial piece of evidence. The camera was aimed at the company's own lot, but its field of view just barely caught the entrance to the warehouse complex next door. The footage showed a silver Civic turning into the industrial complex that morning, slowing near the western row of warehouses, then disappearing from the frame as it drove deeper into the complex. When investigators zoomed in as much as the poor image quality would allow, the front of the car and a distinctive reflection on the door glass matched the earlier descriptions and footage. It was Rachel's car. No question. But here's what made the footage significant: there was no footage of the car leaving afterward. The security system recorded continuously throughout the day, and at no point did the silver Civic emerge from the warehouse complex. The system only captured 2 frames per second, so the images were jerky and incomplete, making it impossible to identify who was actually inside the car. But the car went in and didn't come out. At least not while the camera was recording. Officers continued checking entrances and exits to the warehouse area. They interviewed the former security guard who'd been on duty that Friday morning. He was an older man, retired from another job, doing security part-time to supplement his income. He recalled a silver car entering the complex that morning. He remembered it specifically because there usually wasn't much traffic, especially early. But he didn't remember seeing it leave during his shift, which ended at 3 in the afternoon. He was certain about that. The rear service gates to the complex had been chained shut for years, he told them. Rusted chains, old padlocks, the kind that hadn't been opened in so long that weeds grew around the base. Only the main entrance was in use, the one he monitored, and he would have seen any car leaving. The visitor log at the security gate showed no record of Rachel's car or name. That suggested whoever drove in either had permission to enter without signing in, which was possible if they were with the tenant, or had simply not bothered to log in. Security wasn't exactly tight. This was a complex of old warehouses, most of them barely in use. Nobody was worried about unauthorized access to empty buildings. By the end of that first full day of investigation, the team had successfully mapped Rachel's route with confirmed sightings. Starting point, her student apartment in Provo, where neighbors saw her leave at approximately 8 in the morning. First stop, the convenience store in Lehigh, where security footage captured her car at approximately 8:45. Final confirmed location, the West Temple Warehouse Complex in South Salt Lake, where a security camera showed her car entering at approximately 9:20 in the morning. After that, all physical traces ended. It was like Rachel and her car had driven into a void. The summary report sent to the shift commander that evening was grimly concise: travel route established. Victim's vehicle last seen at West Temple Industrial Warehouse Complex, South Salt Lake. No confirmed sighting of victim after 9:20 a.m., May 10th. The next morning, Sunday, the investigation kicked into higher gear. After confirming the silver Honda Civic's final appearance on that security footage, the team conducted a full sweep of the West Temple warehouse row. 2 patrol officers and a forensic unit from Salt Lake County entered the complex at approximately 10 in the morning. The place was exactly what you'd expect from an industrial area slowly dying: cracked asphalt, weeds pushing through every gap, buildings with broken windows and faded paint, the smell of old oil and rust hanging in the air. They found the car about 50 meters from the main gate, parked against the north wall. From a distance, it looked like any parked car. But as they got closer, details emerged that made it clear this vehicle had been sitting there for a while. A thin layer of dust coated the hood and windshield, the kind of dust that settles when something hasn't moved for at least 24 hours. The front tires were caked with dried mud, suggesting the car had been driven on unpaved surfaces recently. The license plate was an exact match for Rachel Lyndon's registration. They'd found her car. But they hadn't found her. The doors were locked, all 4 of them. No signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No scratches around the locks suggesting someone had tried to jimmy them open. The windows were closed tight. The passenger side mirror was slightly folded in, as if it had been bumped while parking or by someone walking past. Inside, looking through the glass, officers noted that the driver's seat was adjusted to a height that matched what Emily had told them about Rachel's preferences. She was 5'4", and the seat was positioned exactly where you'd expect for someone that height. The steering wheel was clean. No obvious signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. Her purse was not on the passenger seat. That was significant. A woman doesn't typically leave her purse behind unless something is wrong. The floor was empty, no obvious personal items scattered around. But on the back seat, they could see a small coil of electrical cord and 2 loose printed pages. From outside the car, the text on the pages was illegible, but they appeared to be script pages or technical notes, consistent with what Rachel would have brought to a lighting test. The car's body had no scratches or dents. The tires were all properly inflated. Police photographed the scene from multiple angles, documenting every detail. They measured the distance from the car to the nearest warehouse door. Tire tracks in the dust and grime of the parking area showed the car had been parked in this exact spot before the day of discovery and hadn't moved since. The tracks told a story: the car had driven in, parked here, and stayed. A small piece of paper under the wiper blade turned out to be an old parking receipt from somewhere else, unrelated to this location. Area signage indicated the warehouses were managed by a local real estate company. Most units were rented for maintenance shops or storage. Several had been vacant for years. In the rental records, Warehouse Unit 4 was listed under the name Marcus Tate on a short-term lease for commercial video production. Police contacted the property office, verified the information, and obtained permission to access the unit. The company representative, a woman who seemed more annoyed than concerned about police involvement, led them to Unit 4. The metal roll-up door was down and secured with a new padlock that looked out of place compared to the rust and decay around it. Faint fingerprints were visible on the metal handle. The representative told them Tate had signed the lease a little over a month earlier. He usually came a few days a week, mostly in the mornings. He kept to himself, didn't cause any problems, paid his rent on time. There had been no notice of him vacating the unit. Investigators checked the adjacent units. Most were empty, holding nothing but shadows and the ghosts of whatever businesses had once operated there. A few contained old materials, broken equipment, things too worthless to move or throw away. None of the units were actively in use. The whole complex had the feeling of a place time had forgotten. They returned to where the Civic was parked and studied the positioning. The car was less than 10 meters from Unit 4's door. Less than 30 feet. Close enough that if you were working in the unit, you could see the car every time you came outside. The front tire track stopped near a drainage grate that ran parallel to the warehouse entrance. A faint skid mark on the asphalt caught one officer's attention. It could have been from turning sharply or from a sudden stop. Hard to say. But there were no drag marks around the car, no signs of a collision, no evidence that anything violent had happened in this spot. All findings were immediately documented with timestamps and GPS coordinates. The forensic team moved in with their equipment, dusting for prints and photographing every surface of the vehicle. They worked methodically, the way forensic technicians do, treating every surface as potentially crucial evidence. The preliminary results were both reassuring and deeply frustrating. No blood. No signs of violence inside or outside the vehicle. No unfamiliar shoe prints in the dust around the car. Everything was clean. Too clean, in a way. When something bad happens to someone, there's usually evidence of it. Here, there was nothing. The scene report completed that afternoon stated in dry, official language, vehicle intact, locked from outside, no physical evidence of conflict. Before leaving the warehouse complex, the lead officer ordered the Honda Civic sealed as temporary evidence and arranged for it to be towed to the Provo Police Department's secure impound facility for a full forensic examination. Every inch of that car would be processed. Every fiber collected. Every surface tested. If there was evidence to be found, they would find it. Unit 4 was also sealed. Yellow police tape went up. Do not enter signs were posted. An investigative hold was placed on the unit, meaning nobody, including Marcus Tate, could access it without police permission. The entire area was cordoned off, transforming the forgotten warehouse complex into an active crime scene. The final note in that day's report read, "Victim's vehicle located at West Temple Warehouse Complex, intact and locked. No signs of struggle. Adjacent unit rented by Marcus Tate." Finding Rachel Lyndon's car at the warehouse complex with no sign it had moved in over a day, and with no sign of Rachel herself, prompted the shift commander to escalate the case to the highest level. What had started as a missing person report was now a suspected criminal investigation. The original patrol report was transferred to the Major Crimes Unit, the division that handles cases where foul play is suspected or confirmed. In the summary sent upstairs, the reporting officer's assessment was blunt: personal vehicle recovered in industrial area. Victim no contact for 36 hours. No evidence of voluntary departure. Strong likelihood of criminal involvement. That assessment landed on the desk of Lieutenant Joseph Kearns, a 20-year veteran who headed major crime investigations. Kearns read through the file, looked at the photos of the abandoned car, studied the timeline, and made his decision immediately. This was now a full criminal investigation. He ordered a formal scene hold signed and made effective until forensic processing was complete, which could take days or even weeks. In an urgent afternoon briefing, Kearns divided his team into two groups. One team would gather everything about Rachel's personal background, bank records going back months, email accounts, travel habits, relationships, academic performance, anything and everything that might provide a clue. The other team would dig into Marcus Tate's history, employment records, criminal background if any existed, personal relationships, financial situation, reputation in the local film community. The forensic unit was given priority, with instructions to analyze every physical piece of evidence they could find. The Honda Civic was to be taken apart if necessary. Unit 4 would be searched top to bottom once they had a warrant. And Marcus Tate, the tenant of Unit 4 and the last person known to have scheduled contact with Rachel, was moved to the very top of the suspect list. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And while you're down there, let me know what you think happened to Rachel. Was Marcus Tate involved? Or is there something else going on that nobody has figured out yet? In missing persons cases, especially those suspected of involving criminal activity, the first 72 hours are absolutely critical. Every hour that passes decreases the likelihood of finding the victim alive. By the time Rachel's car was discovered on Saturday afternoon, more than 30 hours had already elapsed since anyone had seen or heard from her. The clock was ticking, and everyone involved in the investigation knew it. But knowing it and being able to do something about it are two very different things. The forensic examination of Rachel's Honda Civic began on Monday morning in a secure bay at the Provo Police Department's impound facility. The team working on it included 2 senior forensic technicians and a specialist from the State Crime Lab. They photographed the exterior from every conceivable angle, documenting every scratch, every mark, every detail. Then they moved to the interior. The car was carefully unlocked using police lockout tools, preserving any potential evidence on the handles. The doors were opened and the interior photographed before anything was touched. The smell that emerged was unremarkable, just the closed-up smell of any car that's been sitting in the sun for a couple of days. No smell of decomposition. No chemical odors. Nothing unusual. The driver's seat position was documented precisely. 5 foot 4 inches from the pedals, exactly consistent with Rachel's height. The steering wheel was dusted for prints. They found prints, lots of them, but they were all consistent with Rachel's own fingers. No unknown prints. The gear shift was in park. The keys were not in the ignition, which meant someone had taken them after parking. That someone was presumably Rachel, but where had she gone after locking the car? The glove compartment contained the usual things: vehicle registration in Rachel's name, insurance documents, a small pack of tissues, a few napkins from fast food restaurants, a pen that had leaked slightly. Nothing unusual. Nothing helpful. The center console held some loose change, a few receipts from gas stations and grocery stores, all dated within the past 2 weeks. Nothing from the day she disappeared. On the back seat, they bagged and tagged the electrical cord and the 2 printed pages. The cord was standard issue, the kind you'd buy at any hardware store, about 6 feet long with no distinguishing marks. The pages turned out to be sides from a script, technical notes about lighting setups and camera angles. Exactly what you'd expect Rachel to have with her for a lighting test. But her bag, the one neighbors had seen her carrying, was nowhere in the vehicle. Neither was her purse or her cell phone. The trunk was examined next. Inside, a spare tire in good condition, a jack, a small toolkit, a blanket that looked like it had been there for years, and an old pair of running shoes. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that advanced the investigation even an inch. Floor mats were removed and examined. Vacuuming of the interior collected fibers, hair, dirt, anything that might provide a clue. All of it would be analyzed, compared, cross-referenced. But the preliminary assessment was discouraging. This car looked like a car that had been driven somewhere and parked. That's all. There was no evidence of violence. No signs of a struggle. No blood or other biological material that would indicate harm had come to someone in this vehicle. The exterior was examined with the same meticulous attention. The tires were checked for anything unusual embedded in the treads. Mud was carefully collected and preserved for analysis, in the hope that it might indicate where the car had been driven. The undercarriage was inspected for damage or evidence. The body was examined under different light sources, looking for traces of paint transfer or impact. Every surface was dusted for prints. What they found, or rather didn't find, was telling. The car was clean. Almost suspiciously clean. There were fingerprints, but they were mostly Rachel's, with a few partial prints that likely belonged to Emily or other friends who'd ridden in the car. There was no evidence that anyone else had been in this vehicle recently. No unknown fingerprints on the door handles or steering wheel. No signs that the car had been wiped down. It was just clean. The final forensic report, completed after 3 days of intensive examination, concluded that the vehicle showed no signs of foul play. No evidence of violence. No indication that Rachel Lyndon had been harmed in or around her car. Which raised an obvious and deeply troubling question: if nothing bad happened in the car, what had happened to Rachel after she parked it? While forensic technicians were taking apart Rachel's car, the investigative team was digging into every aspect of her life. They started with her computer, a desktop tower she kept in her apartment. The hard drive was imaged and analyzed. Email accounts were accessed with permission from her parents. What they found was a picture of a dedicated student living a normal life. Rachel's emails were almost boring in their ordinariness. Messages to and from classmates about group projects and assignments. Correspondence with professors about her thesis film. A few personal emails to friends, making plans for coffee or discussing movies they'd seen. Several emails to her parents, warm and chatty, talking about classes and her excitement about graduating. There was absolutely nothing in her digital life that suggested any kind of trouble. No threatening messages. No evidence of stalking or harassment. No indication that she was afraid of anyone or anything. Her bank records were equally unrevealing. Regular deposits from a part-time job she'd held the previous semester at a bookstore near campus. Routine expenses, rent, groceries, gas, occasional meals out, textbooks. Her account balance was healthy for a college student. She wasn't in debt. There were no large unexplained withdrawals or deposits. No financial motive for her to disappear. The last transaction on her account was 2 days before she vanished, a small purchase at a grocery store. After that, nothing. Her cell phone records showed a normal pattern of calls and texts. Most were to Emily, her parents, a few other friends from school. On the morning she disappeared, her phone had made one call at 7:53 a.m. The call was to Emily, lasted less than a minute, probably just Rachel confirming she was leaving for the warehouse. After that, the phone's signal was last detected by a cell tower near South Salt Lake at approximately 9:25 a.m., right around the time she would have been arriving at the warehouse. Then the phone went dark. Either it was turned off, the battery died, or it was destroyed. Investigators interviewed Rachel's professors at BYU. All of them described her as an excellent student, conscientious, talented, professional. She'd never missed a class without explanation. She'd never been in any kind of trouble academically. One professor mentioned that Rachel had seemed excited about working with Marcus Tate, viewing it as a good networking opportunity in the local film community. That comment would become significant later. Friends and classmates were interviewed. The picture that emerged was consistent. Rachel was quiet but friendly, focused on her work, not really part of the party scene. She didn't drink. She didn't do drugs. She had a small circle of close friends and was happy with that. Nobody could think of anyone who would want to harm her. Nobody knew of any conflicts in her life, any threats, any reason she might be in danger. She was, by all accounts, just a normal college student working hard to achieve her dreams. Emily, her roommate, provided the most detailed information. They'd lived together for 2 years and had become close friends. Emily described Rachel as organized to the point of being a bit obsessive about it. Her side of the room was always neat. She made her bed every morning. She had a routine and stuck to it. Emily said that if Rachel said she'd be somewhere at a certain time, she'd be there. That reliability made her absence all the more alarming. This wasn't someone who would blow off plans or forget to call. If Rachel wasn't home and wasn't answering her phone, something was wrong. But for all the investigating, for all the interviews and records checks and background digging, the team learned nothing that helped them understand what had happened to Rachel Lyndon. Her life was an open book, and the pages were disappointingly blank of any clues. The other half of the investigation focused on Marcus Tate, and here things got more interesting. Tate was 28 years old, 7 years older than Rachel. He'd been living in the Salt Lake area for about 5 years, moving there from California with ambitions of making it as an independent filmmaker. He'd managed to get a few short films into local festivals, nothing that launched his career but enough to give him some credibility in the small Utah independent film scene. Background checks revealed that Tate had no criminal record. Not even a parking ticket. He'd never been arrested, never been in trouble with the law. On paper, he looked clean. But investigators knew that a clean record doesn't mean someone is incapable of crime. It just means they haven't been caught yet. They dug deeper. Tate's employment history was spotty. He'd worked a series of odd jobs while pursuing his filmmaking dreams: production assistant on a few commercials, camera operator for local events, some freelance video editing. He never stayed anywhere long, always moving on to the next gig, always looking for the opportunity that would give him his big break. Money seemed to be a constant issue. His bank records showed an account that regularly hovered near zero, with occasional deposits from freelance work keeping him just barely afloat. The warehouse unit on West Temple was the most expensive thing he'd committed to in years. The rental agreement showed he'd paid last month, and a security deposit, which had probably cleaned out whatever savings he had. The unit was rented specifically for his short film project, which he'd been promoting as his breakthrough piece. He'd told people it was about isolation and paranoia, themes that would later seem grimly ironic. Investigators spoke with people in the local film community who knew Tate. The feedback was mixed. Some described him as passionate and dedicated, willing to work long hours to get the shots he wanted. Others used words like intense and obsessive. A few mentioned that he could be temperamental, that he didn't handle criticism well, that he had a tendency to blame others when things went wrong on his projects. One person described him as having a martyr complex, always talking about how he was suffering for his art, how nobody understood his vision. Several people mentioned that Tate had a habit of recruiting young film students to work on his projects, usually for free or for minimal pay. He'd promise them experience, tell them it would be good for their portfolios, say that this film was going to be something special that would help everyone involved. Rachel wasn't the first student he'd approached for help. But she was the first one to disappear. When investigators contacted Marcus Tate to ask him to come in for an interview, he agreed immediately. No hesitation. No request for a lawyer. He came into the Provo Police Department on Monday afternoon, 3 days after Rachel's disappearance, and sat down across from Detectives Sarah Chen and Mike Rodriguez in a small interview room. The conversation was recorded, as all such interviews are. Tate seemed nervous, but then most people are nervous when they're being questioned by police, even when they've done nothing wrong. Tate's account of that Friday was straightforward. He'd arranged for Rachel to come help with a lighting test at his warehouse around 9:30 in the morning. She'd contacted him the week before after hearing through mutual acquaintances that he was working on a project. He'd explained what he needed, someone who understood lighting to help him test different setups before he started shooting. She'd seemed enthusiastic, he said. Professional. He'd given her the warehouse address and told her to meet him there. According to Tate, he'd arrived at the warehouse around 9 in the morning to set up before Rachel got there. He'd opened up Unit 4, arranged some of the lights he'd borrowed from a rental house, set up a few things on the set he'd been building. Then he'd waited for Rachel to arrive. And waited. And waited. By 10 o'clock, she still hadn't shown up. He'd tried calling her cell phone several times, but it went straight to voicemail. He'd figured she'd changed her mind or forgotten. Student volunteers, he said with something like bitterness, weren't always reliable. By 10:30, he'd given up waiting and started testing the lights himself, taking notes on what worked and what didn't. He'd worked until around noon, then locked up the warehouse and left. He'd driven to a diner for lunch, then spent the afternoon at home working on his shooting script. He hadn't thought much more about Rachel not showing up. He'd been annoyed, but that was all. He certainly hadn't known she was missing. Detectives pressed him on the details. Had he seen Rachel's car in the parking area? No, he said. He'd parked right in front of his unit, and he hadn't noticed any silver Honda. Had anyone else been at the warehouse complex that morning? Not that he'd seen. The place was usually deserted. That's why he'd rented there. It was quiet, private, good for working without interruptions. Did he leave the warehouse at any point before giving up on waiting for Rachel? No, he'd stayed inside the whole time, working on his setup. What about the warehouse itself? What was inside Unit 4? Tate described a space he'd been converting into a film set, some flats he'd built to create walls, a few pieces of furniture, his lighting equipment, his camera gear. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Detectives asked if they could see inside the unit. Tate hesitated for the first time. He said he'd prefer they didn't, not because he had anything to hide, but because he had expensive equipment in there and he was worried about it being moved or damaged. It was a reasonable concern, perhaps. Or perhaps it was the reaction of someone with something to hide. The interview lasted about 90 minutes. Tate answered every question put to him. He maintained consistent eye contact. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't become defensive or hostile. He seemed genuinely concerned when detectives told him that Rachel was considered missing and that they were treating her disappearance as suspicious. He offered to help in any way he could. He gave them permission to check his phone records, his alibi for the rest of that day. But something about the interview bothered Detective Chen. She couldn't put her finger on it exactly. Tate's answers were too smooth, too practiced. He never fumbled for words. He never had to think about his responses. It was like he'd rehearsed. Or maybe that was just how he talked, how his mind worked. Some people are naturally articulate under pressure. Others fall apart. Tate was definitely the former. After the interview, Chen and Rodriguez compared notes. They both felt like Tate was hiding something, but neither could point to anything concrete. He'd answered their questions. His story was plausible. He had no obvious motive to harm Rachel. They'd only just started working together. There was no evidence of any prior relationship between them, no history of conflict. On paper, there was no reason for Marcus Tate to make Rachel Lyndon disappear. But the facts remained. Rachel had driven to Tate's warehouse and vanished. Her car was found parked just meters from his rented unit. Tate claimed he'd never seen her that day, but there was no way to prove or disprove that claim. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without Rachel herself, they had nothing but suspicion. The team obtained a search warrant for Warehouse Unit 4. It took 2 days to get it approved. the judge requiring substantial evidence that a crime might have been committed before authorizing the search. On Wednesday morning, 6 days after Rachel's disappearance, a team of investigators and forensic technicians descended on the West Temple warehouse complex. Marcus Tate was required to be present when they opened the unit, and he showed up with a lawyer this time. The change was noted. He was nervous now in a way he hadn't been during the first interview. His lawyer did most of the talking, insisting that any equipment be handled carefully, that nothing be removed from the premises without proper documentation, that his client was cooperating fully but under protest. The metal roll-up door to Unit 4 was opened, light spilling into the space for the first time in days. What lay inside was both exactly what Tate had described and yet somehow different in ways that were hard to articulate. The unit was large, maybe 50 feet by 40 feet, with concrete floors and metal walls that echoed with every sound. Tate had indeed been building a set. There were flats arranged to create the impression of an interior room, though they were only partially constructed. Lighting equipment was set up in various positions: stands, clamps, reflectors, professional-grade stuff that looked expensive. A camera on a tripod sat in one corner, covered with a cloth. Some furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a couch that had seen better days. But there was something off about the space. It felt staged in more than just the obvious way. It felt too clean for a workspace. The floor had been swept recently. There was no dust on any of the equipment, no disorder anywhere. Most working film sets are chaotic: cables everywhere, equipment scattered around, notes and scripts lying about. This was neat. Obsessively neat. Like someone had cleaned up carefully. Investigators documented everything. Photographed from every angle. Measured distances. Examined surfaces for fingerprints. The forensic team moved through methodically, their work taking hours. They found fingerprints on the equipment, the furniture, the light switches. Many were Tate's. Others couldn't immediately be identified and would need to be compared against Rachel's prints from her apartment and her car. In a corner behind one of the flats, they found something that made everyone stop: a woman's bag. Brown canvas with leather straps, exactly matching the description of the bag Rachel's neighbors had seen her carrying when she left her apartment that Friday morning. Inside, script pages, the film drive she'd been carrying, a notebook with her handwriting, a pen. Everything you'd expect to find in a film student's work bag. Everything except Rachel herself. The discovery of the bag changed everything. It meant Rachel had definitely been inside Unit 4. Tate had lied when he said she'd never shown up. The bag proved she'd been there. The question now wasn't whether she'd arrived at the warehouse, but what had happened to her after she got there. Marcus Tate was immediately placed under arrest for making false statements to police during a criminal investigation. As officers handcuffed him and read him his rights, his lawyer protested loudly, insisting there was a simple explanation, that this was all a misunderstanding. Tate himself said nothing. His expression was unreadable. He went quietly. The search of Unit 4 continued for the rest of the day and into the night. Investigators pulled up sections of the floor, checked behind the flats, examined every inch of the space. They were looking for evidence of violence, for blood, for any sign that Rachel had been harmed in this space. They found nothing. No blood spatter. No signs of a struggle. No damage to the walls or floor that would indicate something violent had occurred. The space was remarkably, frustratingly clean. A cadaver dog was brought in, a German shepherd trained to detect the scent of human decomposition. The dog moved through the warehouse methodically, sniffing every corner, every surface. At one point, near the back of the unit, the dog showed some interest, sitting and alert in a way that indicated it might have detected something. But when that area was examined more closely, nothing was found. The dog's reaction was noted in the report, but without physical evidence to back it up, it meant little. The forensic team collected samples from the drains in the warehouse, hoping to find traces of blood that might have been washed away. They swabbed surfaces with luminol, a chemical that causes blood to fluoresce under ultraviolet light even after it's been cleaned. They found nothing. If Rachel had been harmed in this space, whoever had done it had cleaned up with extraordinary thoroughness. Or perhaps she hadn't been harmed there at all. The equipment in the unit was catalogued and photographed. The camera was examined. Film students would recognize it as a Panasonic DVX-100, a popular model for independent filmmaking in the early 2000s. The tape inside was removed and analyzed. It contained about 20 minutes of test footage, Tate himself walking around the set, adjusting lights, making notes. Nothing helpful. Nothing incriminating. There was no footage of Rachel. One detail that investigators found odd was the electrical cord. Not the one found in Rachel's car, but others like it scattered around the warehouse. Tate explained that they were for the lights, standard equipment for any film shoot. But there were more of them than seemed necessary, coiled neatly in various spots around the unit. When asked about this, Tate's lawyer simply said his client was organized and liked to have backup equipment available. A reasonable explanation, perhaps. The warehouse search concluded with a frustrating result. They'd proven that Rachel had been there, that Tate had lied about that, but they still had no idea what had happened to her. No body. No evidence of violence. No indication of where she might have gone after arriving at the warehouse. The only tangible new piece of evidence was her bag, which confirmed her presence but shed no light on her fate. Marcus Tate was held in custody while investigators tried to build a case against him. He was charged with obstruction of justice for lying to police, but that was a relatively minor offense. What they really wanted was to charge him with something more serious, but without a body, without physical evidence of a crime, they couldn't. Utah law, like the law in most states, makes it very difficult to charge someone with murder when you can't prove the victim is actually dead. Over the next several days, investigators interviewed everyone they could find who knew Marcus Tate. His landlord at the apartment where he lived described him as quiet, paid his rent on time, no complaints. Neighbors said they rarely saw him, he kept to himself. His ex-girlfriend from 2 years earlier was tracked down and interviewed. She described their relationship as intense, said Tate could be possessive and jealous, but that he'd never been physically violent with her. When they broke up, he'd taken it hard but eventually moved on. Former colleagues from various film projects shared mixed impressions. Most agreed that Tate was talented but difficult to work with. He had specific visions for his projects and didn't like when people questioned his decisions. He could be charming when he wanted something from you, but cold when he didn't get his way. A few people mentioned incidents where Tate had gotten angry on set, shouting at crew members or actors who didn't perform to his standards. But anger isn't a crime. Temperament isn't evidence. The forensic analysis of evidence from the warehouse took weeks. Every fingerprint had to be identified and compared. Every fiber had to be examined. Every sample from the drains had to be tested. The results, when they finally came back, were disappointing. Rachel's fingerprints were found on her bag, as expected, and on a few surfaces in the warehouse, a door handle, one of the light stands, the arm of the couch. This confirmed she'd been in the space and had moved around some. But there were no defensive wounds indicated by broken fingernails or torn fabric. No signs of a struggle. Tate's fingerprints were everywhere, which made sense since it was his workspace. But there were no unidentified fingerprints that might belong to a third party, no evidence that anyone else had been present that day. The mud from Rachel's car tires was analyzed and compared to soil samples from around the warehouse complex. It matched. She'd driven through the unpaved areas around the complex, probably navigating the rough parking area. Her cell phone was never found. Despite extensive searches of the warehouse, the surrounding area, and even nearby dumpsters and bodies of water, the phone never turned up. Without it, investigators couldn't determine who she might have called or texted in her final hours, couldn't track her precise movements. The phone's disappearance was suspicious in itself. People don't typically lose their phones in ways that make them completely unrecoverable. The district attorney reviewed the case carefully. The evidence against Marcus Tate was largely circumstantial. Yes, he'd lied about Rachel being at the warehouse, but he'd later claimed through his lawyer that he'd simply been confused, that he'd been so focused on his work that he might not have noticed her arrive and leave, that finding her bag later had made him panic and he'd made a bad decision not to come forward immediately. It was a flimsy explanation, but it created reasonable doubt. Without a body, without physical evidence of violence, without any witness to what happened in that warehouse, the DA concluded they didn't have enough to charge Tate with murder or even kidnapping. The obstruction charge would stick, but that carried a maximum sentence of just a few years. It wasn't justice for Rachel Lyndon. It wasn't even close. Marcus Tate eventually pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and making false statements to police. He was sentenced to 18 months in county jail. At his sentencing, he made a statement. He said he was sorry for lying to police. He said he wished he could help find Rachel, but he truly didn't know what had happened to her. He claimed that when he'd found her bag in his warehouse after she'd been reported missing, he'd panicked, thinking it would make him look guilty. So he'd said nothing. It was a mistake, he acknowledged. But it wasn't murder. The judge, visibly frustrated with the limitations of the law, gave him the maximum sentence allowed under the charges. 18 months. For a young woman's disappearance. For a life interrupted. It seemed like nothing at all. Rachel's parents sat in the courtroom and listened to Tate's statement. Her mother, Patricia, had aged years in the months since her daughter vanished. The hope that had burned so brightly in those first days had dimmed but never quite extinguished. She still believed, had to believe, that Rachel was out there somewhere. That maybe she had amnesia. That maybe she'd been taken somewhere far away. That maybe, somehow, she'd come home. Patricia Lyndon refused to accept that her daughter was dead. Without a body, without definitive proof, she held on to the possibility that Rachel was alive. She founded a missing persons advocacy group. She kept Rachel's case in the public eye as much as she could. Every year on the anniversary of Rachel's disappearance, she held a candlelight vigil. Every year, fewer people came, until it was just Patricia and a handful of family members standing in the parking lot of that warehouse complex, holding candles against the darkness, remembering a girl who might still be out there somewhere. Marcus Tate served his sentence and was released after 14 months for good behavior. He moved away from Utah immediately, reportedly to Oregon. Attempts to track him over the years showed he lived a quiet life, working in warehouses and factories, nothing to do with film anymore. He gave one interview to a true crime podcast about 5 years after Rachel's disappearance. In it, he maintained his innocence. He said he understood why people suspected him, but he hadn't harmed Rachel. He had no idea what happened to her. He'd spent years thinking about it, replaying that day in his mind, wishing he'd done things differently. But he couldn't change the past. The interviewer noted that Tate seemed genuinely haunted by the case, though whether by guilt or simply by the association was impossible to say. The Rachel Lyndon case went cold. The file remained open, technically, but no new leads emerged. Detectives moved on to other cases. New crimes demanded attention. Rachel became another name in a database, another unsolved disappearance, another family left without answers. The years accumulated. 2002 became 2005 became 2010. The case file grew dusty. The evidence boxes sat in storage. Life continued for everyone except Rachel, and except perhaps for Patricia Lyndon, who couldn't move forward while her daughter's fate remained unknown. In 2015, 13 years after Rachel vanished, there was a brief revival of interest in the case. A true crime television show featured Rachel's disappearance in an episode. They interviewed Patricia, who by then was in her 60s but still fighting for answers. They showed photos of Rachel, young, smiling, full of potential. They walked through the timeline, pointed out the suspicions around Marcus Tate, noted the frustrating lack of evidence. The episode generated some tips, people calling in saying they'd seen someone who looked like Rachel in various places around the country. Every tip was investigated. Every one led nowhere. Either the sightings were mistaken identities, or the leads evaporated when examined closely. Rachel remained missing. Technology advanced. What had been impossible in 2002 became routine by 2015. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Digital forensics could recover data from devices that seemed destroyed. New techniques for analyzing old evidence were developed. The Utah State Police reviewed several cold cases to see if new technology might help solve them. Rachel Lyndon's case was on the list. Some evidence from the original investigation was reanalyzed using updated methods. Fingerprints that had been unclear in 2002 were re-examined with better imaging technology. The results were the same. Rachel had been in the warehouse, so had Tate. No one else was clearly indicated. Fiber evidence from her car and the warehouse was compared using more advanced techniques. Again, nothing new emerged. The mud from her tires, the dust from the warehouse floor, the samples from the drains, all reanalyzed, all yielding the same disappointing results. But technology, for all its advances, couldn't create evidence that didn't exist. It couldn't conjure a body from thin air. It couldn't make Marcus Tate confess if he was guilty, or prove his innocence if he wasn't. The case remained frustratingly opaque, a mystery without enough pieces to solve the puzzle. Rachel Lyndon had driven to a warehouse one spring morning and disappeared. That was all anyone knew for certain. By 2020, 18 years after Rachel's disappearance, Patricia Lyndon was in her 70s. She'd never given up, but the constant searching had taken its toll. Her health was declining. Her other children worried about her obsession with finding Rachel, the way it had consumed her life. But Patricia couldn't let go. She couldn't accept that she might die without knowing what happened to her daughter. She continued to contact the police regularly, asking if there were any updates, pushing for the case to remain active. She posted on social media, keeping Rachel's name and face circulating, hoping that someone, somewhere, knew something. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted everything, including cold case investigations. Police departments were stretched thin dealing with current crises. Old cases were pushed even further to the back burner. But in 2022, 20 years after Rachel's disappearance, something changed. The Utah State Police hired a new cold case detective, a woman named Jessica Martinez who'd made a name for herself solving old cases in California using fresh perspectives and new investigative techniques. Martinez was assigned a stack of cold cases to review, and Rachel Lyndon's file was near the top. Martinez spent weeks going through every document, every photo, every piece of evidence. She read the original investigation reports, the interview transcripts, the forensic analyses. She looked at the case from every angle, trying to see it with fresh eyes, trying to find what others had missed. At first, she saw what everyone else had seen, a circumstantial case against Marcus Tate that could never be proven. A missing woman whose fate remained unknown. A family without closure. But Detective Martinez had a theory about cold cases. She believed that often the answer was already in the file, hidden in plain sight, overlooked because investigators were focused on other things or because the significance of certain details only became clear with hindsight. She read through the file multiple times, each time looking for something different. What had people assumed? What questions hadn't been asked? What evidence had been dismissed as irrelevant? On her fourth pass through the file, something caught her attention. It was a small detail, barely a footnote in one of the forensic reports. When Rachel's car had been processed, technicians had noted that the driver's seat was positioned at the proper height for someone of Rachel's stature, 5'4". They documented the seat position carefully because it confirmed Rachel had been the last person to drive the car. But there was another detail in that same report, mentioned almost in passing, the seat's position relative to the steering wheel. The seat wasn't just at the right height for Rachel. It was also pushed back further than would be comfortable for someone of her height. Martinez had been a patrol officer before becoming a detective, and she'd driven a lot of different cars in her career. She knew that people adjust their seats in very particular ways. Height is important, but so is the distance from the pedals. A person who is 5'4" typically needs the seat relatively close to the steering wheel to reach the pedals comfortably. Rachel's seat had been at the right height but pushed back several inches further than expected. The original forensic report had noted this but attributed it to individual preference. Some people like to sit farther back. Some people have longer legs relative to their height. It wasn't considered significant. But Martinez wondered, what if it was significant? What if it meant something else entirely? She dug deeper into the report, looking for measurements. The seat position had been documented in detail: height, distance from the steering wheel, angle of the backrest. She compared these measurements to what would be expected for someone of Rachel's height and build based on ergonomic studies. The discrepancy was noticeable. Not huge, but enough that most people would find it uncomfortable. Why would Rachel drive with her seat in a position that was awkward for her? Martinez requested the original evidence photos of the car's interior. She studied them carefully, zooming in on every detail. The driver's seat. The steering wheel. The pedals. The mirrors. And that's when she saw it, the rearview mirror. In the photos, the rearview mirror was angled slightly upward, more than would be necessary for someone of Rachel's height. Again, the original investigators had noted this but hadn't considered it significant. Mirrors get bumped. Angles shift. People readjust them all the time. But Martinez saw a pattern. The seat pushed back. The mirror angled up. Both adjustments consistent with someone taller than Rachel being the last person to actually drive the car. Not just sit in it, but drive it. Which raised a question that nobody had apparently asked in 20 years, was Rachel Lyndon actually the last person to drive her own car? Everyone had assumed she was. She'd left her apartment that morning, neighbors saw her get in the car and drive away. Security footage showed her car at the gas station in Lehigh, at the warehouse complex. It seemed obvious that Rachel had driven herself to the warehouse, parked the car, and then something had happened to her. But what if that sequence of events was wrong? What if someone else had driven the car to the warehouse? What if Rachel hadn't been behind the wheel? Martinez pulled up the security footage from the gas station in Lehigh, the footage showing Rachel's car at Pump 3. She watched it again, carefully. The image quality was terrible, even by 2002 standards. You could make out that it was a silver Honda Civic. You could see the license plate if you zoomed in. But could you see who was driving? Martinez enhanced the image as much as modern technology would allow. The driver was visible only as a vague shape through the windshield. Dark hair, light-colored clothing, consistent with Rachel's description. But you couldn't see a face. You couldn't make out features. Could it have been someone else? Someone wearing similar clothes, someone with dark hair like Rachel's? Martinez then looked at the security footage from the trucking company near the warehouse. Again, the image quality was poor. The car was visible, but the driver was just a shadow through the glass. Everyone had assumed it was Rachel because it was her car. But what if it wasn't her? This line of thinking led Martinez to reconsider the entire timeline. What if Rachel had never made it to the warehouse at all? What if something had happened to her between her apartment and Lehigh, and someone else had driven her car the rest of the way? But who? And why? There was one obvious answer: Marcus Tate. But Tate had claimed he was at the warehouse waiting for Rachel, that she'd never shown up. If he'd actually intercepted her somewhere else, taken her car, driven it to the warehouse himself, then his entire story was a lie. Which was already known, he'd lied about Rachel being at the warehouse. But this would be a much bigger lie, a more calculated deception. Martinez looked at the timeline again. Rachel left her apartment around 8 in the morning. The gas station footage showed her car in Lehigh at approximately 8:45. The warehouse security camera showed the car arriving around 9:20. That was 35 minutes to drive roughly 15 miles, which was actually slower than normal. Traffic on I-15 could be heavy, but on a Friday morning going from Lehigh to South Salt Lake, 35 minutes was more time than needed. What if there had been a stop somewhere that wasn't captured on camera? What if something had happened during that window? Marcus Tate had claimed he arrived at the warehouse around 9 in the morning. But was there any proof of that? Martinez checked the original investigation notes. Tate's alibi for the morning had been checked, but loosely. He lived alone. He had no one to confirm what time he'd left his apartment. The warehouse had no time-stamped entry log. He'd said 9 in the morning, and investigators had no reason to doubt it, so they'd accepted it. But what if he'd left much earlier? What if he'd been somewhere else entirely? Martinez started mapping out alternative scenarios. Scenario 1, Tate intercepts Rachel somewhere between her apartment and Lehigh. How would he know when she was leaving or what route she'd take? He wouldn't, unless she'd told him, which seemed unlikely. Or unless he'd been watching her apartment, waiting for her to leave. Possible, but risky. Scenario 2, Tate intercepts Rachel at the gas station in Lehigh. She stops for coffee, he's there waiting, something happens. But the gas station was public, security cameras, witnesses. Too risky. Scenario 3, Tate intercepts Rachel somewhere between Lehigh and the warehouse. She's driving on I-15, he's in another vehicle, he signals her to pull over, or forces her off the road, or something. Then he takes her, where? And drives her car to the warehouse to make it look like she arrived there. None of these scenarios were perfect. All had problems. But they were possible in ways that hadn't been seriously considered before. The original investigation had focused on what happened at the warehouse because that's where all the evidence pointed. But what if the evidence had been staged? What if the warehouse was never the primary crime scene? Martinez decided to look at Marcus Tate's vehicle situation. In 2002, what had he been driving? She dug through the original investigation notes and found a reference. Tate had owned a 1998 Ford Ranger pickup truck, dark blue. The truck had been briefly examined during the original investigation but not processed as evidence because there was no clear connection to Rachel's disappearance. The assumption had been that any crime occurred at the warehouse, so Tate's personal vehicle seemed irrelevant. But if Martinez's theory was right, if Tate had intercepted Rachel somewhere else, then his truck might have been the actual crime scene. She checked the evidence logs. The truck had not been impounded or forensically examined. 20 years later, there was almost no chance it still existed or that any evidence could be recovered from it even if it did. But the fact that it hadn't been examined thoroughly at the time was significant. It was a gap in the original investigation. Martinez spent days developing her theory, testing it against the known facts, looking for anything that contradicted it. She came up with a possible sequence of events. Rachel leaves her apartment as witnessed. She drives toward the warehouse, following the route along I-15. At some point, possibly near Lehigh, Marcus Tate intercepts her. Maybe he'd called her and asked her to meet him somewhere else first. Maybe he'd followed her and forced her to pull over. However it happened, Tate gains control of Rachel and her car. He drives her car to the warehouse with Rachel as a passenger, or perhaps with Rachel already incapacitated in the vehicle somewhere out of sight. That would explain the seat and mirror positions being wrong. Someone taller had adjusted them while driving. At the warehouse, something happens to Rachel. Tate stages the scene to make it look like she arrived and then vanished. He leaves her car parked there. He leaves her bag inside the warehouse to prove she'd been there. Then he drives away in his own vehicle, which had been parked nearby. It was speculative. It was based on thin evidence, seat positions and mirror angles that could have other explanations. But it felt right to Martinez in a way the original theory never had. The original theory required believing that Rachel had arrived safely at the warehouse, gone inside, and then vanished without a trace, with no evidence of violence, no body, no indication of what happened. That had always seemed unlikely. Martinez's theory, while still troubling in many ways, at least provided a different framework for understanding the case. But proving it was another matter. 20 years had passed. Marcus Tate, if he was guilty, had gotten away with it. His truck was long gone. Any evidence that might have been in it was destroyed decades ago. Rachel's body, if there was a body, had never been found. All the new technology and fresh perspective in the world couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. There was no physical evidence linking Tate to Rachel's disappearance beyond the circumstantial facts that she'd been going to meet him and her bag was found in his warehouse. Martinez wrote up her findings in a detailed report. She laid out her theory about the seat and mirror positions, about the possibility that someone else had been driving Rachel's car. She noted the gaps in the original investigation, particularly the failure to thoroughly examine Tate's vehicle. She concluded that while her theory couldn't be proven, it provided a more coherent explanation for the evidence than the original working theory had. The report made its way up the chain of command. It generated some interest. The case had been cold for 20 years, any new perspective was valuable. But ultimately, it didn't change anything. There was no new evidence to gather. No new witnesses to interview. Marcus Tate was living somewhere in Oregon, and while they could question him again, there was no reason to think he'd say anything different than what he'd said 20 years earlier. He'd maintained his innocence then. He'd maintain it now. Patricia Lyndon was informed of the new findings. At 73, she'd spent more than half her life searching for her daughter. Martinez visited her in person to explain the theory about the seat positions, about the possibility that Rachel had never actually driven to the warehouse herself. Patricia listened carefully, her face etched with lines of grief and determination that 20 years of unanswered questions had carved there. "So you think he took her somewhere else?" Patricia said when Martinez finished. "You think something happened before she ever got to that warehouse?" "I think it's possible," Martinez said carefully. "I can't prove it. But the evidence is more consistent with that scenario than with the idea that she drove herself there and disappeared." "Where would he have taken her?" Patricia asked. "Where is my daughter?" Martinez had no answer to that question. She could theorize about what happened, but without physical evidence, without a body, the specific details remained unknowable. "I don't know," she admitted. "I wish I did." Patricia was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that struck Martinez as profound. "At least now I know someone is still looking. At least someone still cares what happened to Rachel." It wasn't much. It wasn't justice. But it was something. Martinez's report generated enough interest that the department decided to take one more run at Marcus Tate. 20 years had passed. People change. Guilt weighs on some people in ways that time makes heavier, not lighter. Sometimes people who maintain their innocence for years eventually confess, either because their conscience finally breaks or because they realize the statute of limitations doesn't apply to murder and they might as well tell the truth. It was a long shot, but they had nothing to lose. 2 detectives traveled to Oregon in the fall of 2022. They found Marcus Tate living in a small apartment in Portland, working as a warehouse manager for a shipping company. He was 48 years old now, 20 years older than when Rachel disappeared. He'd put on weight. His hair was thinning. He looked tired in the way middle-aged people who've had hard lives often look tired. The detectives identified themselves and asked if he'd be willing to answer some questions about the Rachel Lyndon case. Tate sighed deeply, like he'd been expecting this, or maybe like he'd been dreading it. "I wondered if someone would ever come back to this," he said. He invited them in. His apartment was neat but sparse. No decorations on the walls. No personal photos. Just furniture and a television and books. A lonely life, the detectives thought. They asked him the same questions that had been asked 20 years earlier. Where had he been that morning? When had he arrived at the warehouse? Had he seen Rachel? Tate gave the same answers he'd given before. He'd been at the warehouse by 9. Rachel had never shown up. He'd waited, then given up and worked on his own. He hadn't seen her car in the parking area. He'd found her bag later and panicked, which he admitted was the stupidest decision of his life, but he hadn't hurt her. He didn't know what happened to her. The detectives pressed harder this time. They told him about the seat positions, about the mirror angle. They suggested that maybe someone else had driven Rachel's car to the warehouse. Someone taller than her. Someone about Tate's height, which was 5'10". Tate's face showed something, surprise, maybe, or concern. You think I drove her car? He asked. Did you? No, Tate said firmly. I never touched her car. I never saw her that day at all. They asked him about his truck, the blue Ford Ranger. Where had he been in that truck that morning? Tate said he'd driven it from his apartment to the warehouse and back, nowhere else. Had anyone been in the truck with him? No, he'd been alone. Would he be willing to take a polygraph test? Tate consulted with a lawyer by phone, then declined. His lawyer advised against it, he said. Not because he had anything to hide, but because polygraphs aren't reliable and he wasn't going to put himself through that again. The interview lasted about 2 hours. At the end of it, the detectives had nothing new. Tate maintained his story. He seemed older, wearier, but no more guilty or innocent than he'd seemed 20 years earlier. Either he was telling the truth, or he was an exceptionally good liar who'd been living with his secret for 2 decades without cracking. Before they left, one of the detectives asked Tate a question that hadn't been in their prepared list. Do you ever think about her? About Rachel? Tate looked out the window of his small apartment. Every day, he said quietly. Every single day for 20 years. People think I killed her. My family thinks it. My ex-girlfriend thinks it. I lost everything because of what happened. My career, my reputation, my freedom for a while. Every job I've had since I got out of jail, as soon as people find out about the case, I'm done. I've moved 3 times trying to start over. It never works. I'm always the guy who probably killed that girl. But did you? The detective asked. No, Tate said, looking directly at him. I didn't. I swear to God, I didn't. And I have no idea what happened to her. I wish I did. I wish I could give her family answers. But I can't. The detectives left with the same feeling everyone who'd worked this case had. Marcus Tate was either completely innocent and had been destroyed by circumstances, or he was guilty and would take his secret to the grave. There was no way to know which. The case remained open but inactive. Martinez had done what she could, bringing a fresh perspective that had identified possible oversights in the original investigation. But ultimately, 2 decades of time had eroded any chance of finding new physical evidence. Rachel Lyndon's disappearance would likely remain a mystery forever, one of those cases that haunts everyone involved but never gets solved. In 2023, 21 years after Rachel vanished, Patricia Lyndon's health deteriorated significantly. She'd been diagnosed with heart disease years earlier, and the stress of her daughter's disappearance had likely accelerated its progression. She spent a week in the hospital in March of that year, and when she was discharged, her family thought about the future. Patricia might not have much time left. They'd spent 21 years hoping for answers, but maybe it was time to accept that answers might never come. Patricia had different thoughts. She'd spent 21 years refusing to give up, and she wasn't about to start now. She contacted Detective Martinez and asked if there was anything at all, that could still be done. Martinez, who'd grown to respect and care about Patricia over the months they'd worked together, promised to go through the file one more time. Maybe there was something she'd missed. Maybe there was one more stone left unturned. Martinez returned to the evidence boxes stored in the basement of the Utah State Police headquarters. 21 years of dust covered them. She pulled out every document, every photo, every piece of physical evidence that had been preserved. She spread it all out in a conference room and looked at it with fresh eyes once again. This time, she wasn't looking for anything specific. She was just looking, hoping something would jump out at her. She went through the photos from the warehouse search. The set Tate had been building. The lighting equipment. The furniture. The walls he'd constructed from flats. She'd seen these photos dozens of times by now, but she looked at them again. Sometimes you see what you expect to see. Sometimes you miss what's actually there because you're looking for something else. And then she saw it. Or rather, she saw something she couldn't quite explain. In one of the photos showing the back corner of the warehouse, behind the flats where Rachel's bag had been found, there was a section of floor that looked different from the rest. The concrete was a slightly different shade. It was subtle. You'd miss it if you weren't looking carefully. But once Martinez noticed it, she couldn't unsee it. She pulled out the forensic reports from the warehouse examination. The floor had been examined, particularly after the cadaver dog had shown interest in that back corner. But the report said no evidence of disturbance had been found. The concrete was intact. There was nothing unusual about it. Yet in the photos, there clearly was something different about that section of floor. Martinez looked at the date on the forensic report. It had been completed about 2 weeks after the initial warehouse search. She looked at the date on the photo showing the floor discoloration. It had been taken on the day of the search. Something had changed between when the photo was taken and when the forensic team did their detailed analysis. But what? She dug deeper into the timeline of the warehouse investigation. After Tate's arrest, the warehouse had been sealed for 3 days while forensic teams processed it. Then it had been released back to the property management company, who'd maintained the seal at police request for another week. Then there was a gap in the documentation. The warehouse had been sealed again 2 weeks later for additional forensic work, which is when that report about the floor had been completed. Martinez called the property management company, which remarkably still existed under the same name. She asked if they had any records from 2002 about Warehouse Unit 4. After some searching, they found a file. It included notes about the property. One note, dated about 10 days after Rachel's disappearance, indicated that the property manager had entered the unit to check for water damage after a rainstorm. The note said, "No water damage observed. Concrete floor repairs in back corner appear to be drying properly. Tenant must have done some work before the incident." Martinez felt her pulse quicken. Concrete floor repairs. That explained the discoloration in the photo. But according to the investigation timeline, Tate had been arrested before those repairs were supposedly made. The warehouse had been sealed. How could work have been done on the floor? Unless the work had been done before Rachel's disappearance. Unless Tate had poured new concrete in that back corner before she arrived that day, or even earlier. She checked Tate's rental agreement and his statements. He'd never mentioned doing any work on the floor. The property management company had no record of giving him permission to alter the concrete. It wasn't prohibited in the lease, but it was unusual. Why would a short-term tenant pour new concrete in a warehouse he was only renting for a few months? Martinez felt like she was finally onto something real. She researched concrete and how long it takes to cure. Fresh concrete needs about 24 to 48 hours to set enough to walk on safely, but it continues curing for weeks. If Tate had poured new concrete in that corner, when had he done it? The warehouse rental records showed he'd first accessed the unit about 6 weeks before Rachel's disappearance. Plenty of time to pour concrete and let it cure. But why would he pour concrete? Warehouses don't typically need new concrete floors unless there's damage. Martinez checked if there'd been any prior damage reports for Unit 4. There hadn't been. The floor had been in decent shape when Tate rented the space. So if he'd poured new concrete, it wasn't to repair existing damage. It was for some other reason. A dark possibility formed in Martinez's mind. What if Tate had been planning Rachel's murder for weeks? What if he'd prepared that warehouse specifically for what he intended to do? What if he'd poured new concrete to cover something? Or to prepare a place to hide something? She looked at the dimensions in the photos. The patch of new concrete appeared to be roughly 6 feet by 3 feet. About the size you'd need to bury a body. Martinez's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone and called her supervisor. "I think I know where Rachel Lyndon is," she said. "I think she's been in that warehouse the whole time." Getting permission to excavate a warehouse floor 21 years after the original investigation was complicated. The warehouse was privately owned. The current tenant had nothing to do with the original case. There were liability issues, cost considerations, and the very real possibility that Martinez was wrong and they'd tear up a floor for nothing. But Martinez pushed. She presented her findings about the concrete, about the timeline, about the property manager's note that had been overlooked for 2 decades. She argued that they owed it to Patricia Lyndon to check, to know for certain. After weeks of bureaucratic wrangling, permission was granted. In May of 2023, almost exactly 21 years after Rachel Lyndon disappeared, a team of investigators and forensic specialists descended on the West Temple warehouse complex once again. Unit 4 had changed tenants several times over the years. The current tenant, a small manufacturing company, was asked to temporarily relocate their equipment. The back corner of the warehouse, where that patch of slightly different concrete had been visible in photos from 2002, was cordoned off. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in first, a technology that had improved significantly since 2002. The radar could detect differences in density beneath the surface, could show if anything was buried under the concrete. The technician moved the equipment slowly over the suspect area, watching the readout screen carefully. After about 20 minutes, he stopped and called Martinez over. "There's definitely something down there," he said. "About 3 feet deep. The density is consistent with organic material." Organic material. It was the most delicate way possible of saying what they were all thinking: a body. After 21 years of searching, of theories and dead ends and frustration, Rachel Lyndon might finally be found. Martinez felt a rush of emotions: relief that they might finally have answers, dread about what those answers would reveal, sadness for Patricia and what this would mean for her. The excavation began the next morning. Concrete saws cut through the floor in a careful grid pattern around the area identified by the radar. Each section of concrete was numbered and photographed before being removed. It was painstaking work, deliberately slow to preserve any evidence that might be beneath. By afternoon, they'd removed enough concrete to reveal what lay underneath. It was dirt. Fresh-looking dirt, darker than the surrounding soil, packed carefully. And as they carefully removed the dirt, layer by layer, they found it. About 3 feet down, wrapped in plastic sheeting and canvas, were human remains. 21 years in the ground had taken their toll, but the body was remarkably preserved thanks to the plastic and the dry Utah climate. It was a woman, small in stature, wearing the remnants of a light-colored jacket. A forensic anthropologist on site made a preliminary examination. The size and structure of the skeleton were consistent with a female in her early 20s. Dental records would confirm it, but everyone present knew, they'd found Rachel Lyndon. She'd been buried in that warehouse 21 years earlier, had been there the whole time investigators searched the building, had been beneath their feet as they interviewed Marcus Tate and processed the scene. The concrete had been poured over her grave, either just before or just after her murder, sealing her beneath the warehouse floor. That's why the cadaver dog had shown interest in that corner. The dog had detected something, but with the concrete and the filled dirt, the scent hadn't been strong enough for a clear alert. The preliminary forensic examination in 2002 had checked the concrete for signs of recent disturbance, but fresh concrete looks different from old concrete for a while. By the time they'd examined it closely, the concrete had cured enough that it hadn't seemed suspicious. It had been noted as a repair, something the tenant must have done, and overlooked. For 21 years, Rachel Lyndon had been right where everyone suspected she'd been, in that warehouse, in Marcus Tate's rented space. But she hadn't been hidden in some clever way. She'd been hidden in the most obvious way possible, buried and covered with concrete, and somehow it had worked. For 21 years, it had worked. The remains were carefully exhumed and transported to the state medical examiner's office for a complete analysis. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew: it was Rachel Lyndon. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, likely from strangulation based on damage to the hyoid bone in her throat. There was no evidence of sexual assault. She'd been killed quickly, efficiently, and then buried in a grave that had likely been prepared in advance. The evidence now painted a clear picture. Marcus Tate had rented the warehouse weeks before Rachel's disappearance. He'd dug a grave in the back corner and prepared it. Then he'd contacted Rachel, either directly or through acquaintances in the film community, and invited her to help with his project. On the morning of May 10, 2002, Rachel had driven toward the warehouse. At some point, possibly along the route, Tate had intercepted her. He might have called and asked her to meet him somewhere else first. He might have followed her and forced her to pull over. However it happened, he gained control of Rachel and her car. He drove her car to the warehouse, with Rachel as a passenger or possibly already dead in the vehicle. The seat position was wrong because Tate, at 5'10", had adjusted it for his height. The mirror was angled wrong for the same reason. At the warehouse, if she wasn't already dead, he killed her. He placed her body in the prepared grave. He covered it with dirt. He mixed and poured concrete over the grave, sealing it. Then he staged the scene to make it look like she'd arrived and disappeared. He left her bag in the warehouse, he parked her car outside, he removed the keys. He'd probably planned to do more to obscure what had happened, but Rachel's disappearance was reported quickly, and police were at the warehouse within days. He had to adapt. When police searched the warehouse, he knew Rachel was literally beneath their feet, but he also knew the fresh concrete looked just enough like an old repair that it might not be questioned. And it wasn't, at least not carefully enough. The question everyone wanted answered was, why? Why had Marcus Tate killed Rachel Lyndon? She was 21 years old, talented, her whole life ahead of her. She'd agreed to help him with his project. What had happened? The truth, when it emerged through additional investigation, was both simpler and more horrible than anyone had imagined. Investigators, armed now with concrete evidence of murder, obtained search warrants for all of Marcus Tate's digital records, past and present. They subpoenaed old email accounts, recovered data from computers he'd used in 2002. What they found was disturbing. In the months before Rachel's disappearance, Tate had been researching how to commit a perfect murder. His search history included queries about forensic evidence, about how police investigate disappearances, about how to dispose of a body. He'd visited forums where people discussed true crime cases, studying how killers had been caught and how they might have avoided it. But more chilling were the journals they found, kept on his computer in encrypted files. The encryption was old, 2002-era security, which meant modern computers could break it relatively easily. In those journals, Tate had written extensively about his fascination with death, with control, with the idea of killing someone. He'd fantasized about it in graphic detail. He'd written about how he'd stage it, how he'd cover it up, how he'd become famous for creating a mystery that no one could solve. And then he'd written about Rachel. He'd seen her around the BYU film department. He'd become fixated on her. Not romantically, the journals made clear, but as a subject. As someone he could use to fulfill his dark fantasies. He'd planned her murder meticulously. The short film project was a fiction, a lure to get her to a place where he had control. The warehouse was chosen specifically because it was isolated. The concrete grave was prepared in advance. Everything had been calculated. Why Rachel specifically? The journal suggested it was almost random. She was the right type, young, dedicated to film, likely to be interested in the opportunity he offered. She was small, which made her easier to control. She lived alone with just a roommate, which meant her disappearance might not be noticed immediately. Tate had watched her, studied her routines, determined she was the ideal victim for what he wanted to do. It was senseless. Utterly senseless. Rachel Lyndon had died because a disturbed man had decided to act out his fantasies of murder, and she'd been convenient. She'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it had cost her everything. There was no grand motive. No crime of passion. No understandable reason. Just the cold calculation of someone who decided to kill and had chosen her. Armed with this new evidence, prosecutors in Utah began the process of charging Marcus Tate with first-degree murder. In Oregon, where Tate had been living, police arrived at his apartment with an arrest warrant. Tate answered the door, saw the police, and according to the officer's report, simply said, "I wondered how long it would take." He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He knew why they were there. Tate was extradited to Utah and charged with the murder of Rachel Lyndon. At his arraignment, he pleaded not guilty, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. His public defender argued that the journals were fiction, creative writing, that the prosecution couldn't prove they were anything more than dark thoughts that Tate had never acted on. The concrete grave was circumstantial. The car evidence was circumstantial. Everything was circumstantial, except for the body, and the defense argued that while Rachel had clearly been buried in Tate's rented warehouse, there was no physical evidence proving Tate had put her there. It was a hopeless defense, everyone knew that. But in the American justice system, even the obviously guilty get their day in court. The trial was scheduled for early 2024, nearly 22 years after Rachel's murder. Patricia Lyndon, who'd spent 2 decades searching for her daughter, would finally see the man who took her stand trial for his crime. Patricia was 74 years old when the trial began. She'd waited 22 years for this moment, and she was determined to see it through despite her failing health. She sat in the courtroom every single day, in the front row directly behind the prosecutors, watching Marcus Tate, who refused to look at her. Her other children and her husband sat with her, supporting her through what they all knew would be a difficult process. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented the forensic evidence: Rachel's remains found in the warehouse Tate had rented, buried in concrete he'd poured. They presented the digital evidence, the search histories about committing murder, the journals describing his plans, the specific mentions of Rachel. They presented the evidence from 2002, the car with the wrong seat position, the bag found in the warehouse, Tate's lies to police. They presented testimony from forensic experts explaining how Rachel had died, how long she'd been buried, how the grave had been prepared. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt. They argued that the journals were creative writing, that Tate was researching for a screenplay about murder, that his interest in true crime was no different from millions of other people who watch crime documentaries and read crime novels. They suggested that someone else might have used Tate's warehouse, that he'd been framed, that the evidence didn't definitively prove he'd killed Rachel. But it was thin, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The most damning testimony came from a forensic psychologist who'd analyzed Tate's journals and writings. The psychologist testified that the journals showed clear premeditation and planning, that the level of detail about Rachel specifically indicated this wasn't fiction but a plan being developed and then executed. The psychologist described Tate as having antisocial personality disorder, someone capable of killing without remorse, someone who'd carefully calculated how to get away with murder and had nearly succeeded. Tate took the stand in his own defense, against his lawyer's advice. He testified that he was innocent, that he'd been wrongly accused for 22 years, that the evidence was being misinterpreted. He claimed the journals were fiction, that he'd never hurt Rachel, that he didn't know how her body had ended up in the warehouse. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor tore his testimony apart, pointing out inconsistencies, confronting him with his own words from the journals, asking him to explain how it was possible that Rachel had been buried in his rented space without his knowledge. "Did you kill Rachel Lyndon?" the prosecutor finally asked, directly and simply. Tate was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "No." "Then how did she end up buried under concrete in the warehouse you rented?" "I don't know," Tate said. But his voice was flat, emotionless in a way that made it clear he was lying. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of evidence tampering. Guilty on every count. Marcus Tate sat motionless as the verdicts were read, showing no emotion. Behind him, Patricia Lyndon wept, not tears of joy but of relief and sorrow mixed together. Her daughter had finally received justice, but that justice came 22 years too late. At sentencing, Patricia was allowed to give a victim impact statement. She stood at the podium, frail and elderly but with a strength of will that filled the courtroom. She talked about Rachel, about the daughter she'd lost, about the 22 years of not knowing, of hoping against hope that somehow Rachel was still alive somewhere. She talked about the pain of finally learning the truth, of knowing that while she'd been searching, Rachel had been buried in that warehouse all along. "You took my daughter from me," Patricia said, looking directly at Marcus Tate. "You took her future. You took her dreams. You took 22 years of my life, years I spent searching for her when I should have been grieving. You're a coward and a murderer, and I hope you spend every remaining day of your life thinking about what you did. I hope Rachel haunts you the way she's haunted me. I hope you never know a moment of peace." Tate still showed no emotion. Even when the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, he remained blank-faced. He was led out of the courtroom in shackles and transported to the Utah State Prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. At 49 years old, he'd likely be in prison for another 30 or 40 years, decades to think about what he'd done, about the life he'd destroyed and the life he'd thrown away. Rachel Lyndon was finally laid to rest properly in May of 2024, 22 years and a few weeks after she'd been murdered. A memorial service was held at a church in Cedar Hills, attended by hundreds of people, family, friends, former classmates, members of the community who'd followed the case for decades. Patricia spoke at the service, talking about Rachel's passion for film, her dedication to her studies, her kindness and her dreams. It was the funeral Rachel should have had 22 years earlier, and while it brought some closure, it also underscored the profound loss of all those years. The case of Rachel Lyndon raised a lot of questions about the original investigation. How had the fresh concrete been overlooked? Why hadn't the cadaver dog's response been taken more seriously? Why hadn't Marcus Tate's vehicle been forensically examined? These were fair questions, and they led to changes in how missing persons cases are handled in Utah. But they didn't change what had happened. They didn't bring back 22 years. They didn't undo the pain. For Detective Jessica Martinez, solving the case brought a sense of accomplishment but also frustration. The answer had been there all along, literally beneath their feet. If someone had just asked the right questions in 2002, if someone had looked more carefully at that fresh concrete, if someone had pushed harder, Rachel might have been found decades earlier. Her family would have had closure. Justice would have been served. But investigative work isn't perfect. Mistakes get made. Details get overlooked. Sometimes cases go cold not because they're unsolvable, but because the crucial piece of evidence gets missed. The key detail in this case, the thing that had been overlooked for more than 20 years, was actually simple: the concrete. That patch of fresh concrete in the back corner of the warehouse, noted in passing but never really investigated, had hidden Rachel's body for 2 decades. The property manager's note about concrete floor repairs had been in the file all along, but nobody had connected it to anything significant. It had seemed like a mundane detail about building maintenance, not a clue to murder. If there's a lesson in this case, it's about the importance of questioning assumptions. The original investigators assumed Rachel had driven herself to the warehouse. They assumed the fresh concrete was unrelated to her disappearance. They assumed that if something had happened to Rachel in that space, there would be obvious evidence of it. All of those assumptions were wrong. Rachel hadn't driven herself, Tate had driven her car. The concrete was directly related, it was covering her grave. And there was evidence, but it was hidden beneath the floor. Patricia Lyndon lived for another 6 months after Rachel was finally laid to rest. She died in November of 2024 at the age of 74, her health having deteriorated rapidly after the trial. Her family said that knowing what happened to Rachel, seeing her killer convicted, and being able to properly bury her daughter had given Patricia the closure she needed. She'd held on for 22 years, driven by the need to know, to understand, to find her child. Once that need was fulfilled, she could finally let go. At Patricia's funeral, her other children spoke about her determination, her refusal to give up on Rachel even when everyone else had moved on. They talked about how she'd dedicated her life to finding the truth, how she'd never stopped believing that answers were possible. She'd founded a support group for families of missing persons, had helped dozens of other families navigate the nightmare of not knowing what happened to their loved ones. Her legacy wasn't just in finally finding Rachel, but in the work she'd done to help others. Marcus Tate remains in prison, serving his life sentence. He's given no interviews, made no statements beyond his not guilty plea and his testimony at trial. He works in the prison library, keeps to himself, has no visitors. According to prison staff, he's a model inmate, quiet and compliant. Whether he feels remorse for what he did, whether he thinks about Rachel, whether he regrets his choices, nobody knows. He's kept his thoughts to himself, just as he kept his dark fantasies to himself for years before acting on them. The warehouse where Rachel was buried has since been demolished. The entire complex was torn down in 2025 to make way for new development. Unit 4, where Rachel died and was hidden for 22 years, no longer exists. There's a marker now at the site, a small plaque placed by Rachel's family, in memory of Rachel Lyndon, 1981 to 2002. Beloved daughter, sister, friend. May her dreams live on in all who create art. The case has been featured in multiple true crime documentaries and podcasts since the trial. It's become a cautionary tale about how missing persons investigations can go wrong, about how crucial details can be overlooked, about how sometimes the answer is hiding in plain sight. It's also a story about persistence, about a mother who refused to give up, about a detective who looked at old evidence with fresh eyes and finally saw what others had missed. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you for bearing witness to Rachel Lyndon's tragedy and to her mother's unwavering determination to find the truth. Cases like these remind us that behind every cold case file is a real person, a real family, real grief that doesn't diminish with time. If you want to honor Rachel's memory, take a moment to think about the missing persons in your own community. Look at their faces on missing person posters. Remember their names. Sometimes, awareness is what keeps a case from going truly cold. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for the Cold Case Desk. We're committed to telling these stories, to keeping these cases alive in the public consciousness, because every victim deserves to be remembered, and every family deserves answers. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment with your thoughts or with the name of a cold case you'd like us to cover. And remember, the truth never stays buried forever. Sometimes it just takes 22 years and the right person asking the right questions to finally bring it to light. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop seeking justice.